There is a place where the Thames bends west through Berkshire, where the land rises sharply from the water on a chalk bluff 100 feet above the river, and where stone meets sky in a silhouette that has not fundamentally changed in nearly 1,000 years. On a grey morning, with mist sitting low across the great park and rain darkening the battlements, Windsor Castle looks less like a building and more like a geological formation. Something that was not built so much as grown from the earth itself. 13 acres of fortified ground, over 1,000 rooms, more than 300 fireplaces, a chapel that holds the bones of 12 monarchs, corridors that stretch for hundreds of metres beneath the state apartments, where servants once moved unseen from dawn until long past dark. It is the largest occupied castle in the world and the longest continually inhabited palace in Europe. 39 kings and queens have called it home, and it has stood in one form or another since the year 1070. But behind these walls lies something more complicated than heritage. Windsor Castle was not built to inspire, it was built to dominate. It was not conceived as a home, but as a weapon. And every transformation it has undergone in the centuries since, every gilded ceiling, every Gothic tower, every immaculate state apartment, has been an act of reinvention designed to serve power in whatever form power demanded at the time. The question is not how this castle survived. The question is what it consumed along the way, and what it reveals about the nation that still lives inside it. If you enjoy deep investigations into Britain's great castles and the families who shaped them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which estate we should explore next. Your support makes these stories possible. When William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel in the autumn of 1066 and killed King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, he did not simply seize a throne, he seized a country, and a country once seized must be held. Within 4 years of his coronation, William had begun constructing a ring of fortifications around London, each positioned a single day's march from the capital and from one another, so that reinforcements could arrive within hours. The Tower of London guarded the east, Windsor guarded the west. The site William chose was not arbitrary. It sat high above the Thames, commanding the river approach to London, and it bordered a vast Saxon hunting forest that the new king intended to claim as his own. The land itself belonged to the manor of Clewer, a Saxon estate. William did not buy it. He took it. The first Windsor Castle was not stone, it was earth and timber. Saxon labourers, men whose country had just been conquered, were put to work digging a vast ditch around the chalk bluff and piling the excavated earth into a mound 50 feet high. On top of that mound they raised a wooden palisade. Around the base they built 2 walled enclosures, upper and lower, forming the basic plan that still defines the castle today. The whole structure was a statement of raw power delivered in mud and oak. The men who dug it are nameless. The records do not mention them. They hauled earth in baskets and shaped a fortress for a king who spoke a language they did not understand, and then they disappeared from history entirely. William himself never lived at Windsor. It was a military outpost, a garrison, a message carved into the landscape. But his youngest son, Henry I, saw something his father had not. Henry moved into the castle around 1110 and became the first monarch to use it as a residence. His marriage to Adela of Louvain took place within its walls in 1121. From that moment, Windsor ceased to be merely a fortress. It became a home, and a home once established demands constant attention. The transformation from timber to stone began under Henry II in the 1160s. Over 14 years, Henry replaced the wooden palisade with a stone shell keep, the round tower that still dominates the skyline today, and added thick outer walls to the north, east and south. He built 2 separate sets of royal apartments, public rooms in the lower ward for official business, and a private residence in the upper ward for his own use. The division between public face and private life, a tension that would define Windsor for the next 8 centuries, was established here in stone, before the 13th century had begun. Stone came from quarries across the region, hauled by cart and by river, cut and dressed by masons who worked in all weathers and were paid by the day. The walls Henry raised were formidable. In places they reached 7 metres thick, but they were tested almost immediately. In 1216, during the First Barons' War, rebel forces loyal to Prince Louis of France laid siege to the castle for 2 months. In the whole of southeast England, only Windsor and Dover held for the English crown. The castle survived. It always survives. That is both its purpose and its curse. Henry III spent lavishly on the interior. Between 1240 and 1263, he built a luxurious palace in the upper ward for Queen Eleanor and their children, added royal chambers, constructed a grand chapel in the lower ward, and installed a new kitchen with a covered walkway. The castle was becoming beautiful, and beauty at Windsor always carries a price. The chalk bluff that gave the castle its strategic advantage also made construction treacherous. Foundations cracked, walls shifted, water seeped through limestone and softened mortar. Maintaining the illusion of permanence required constant, expensive, invisible labour. But it was Edward III who left the deepest mark on medieval Windsor. Born within the castle walls in 1312, Edward was obsessed with chivalric ideals and determined to make Windsor the spiritual centre of English knighthood. In 1348 he founded the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious order of chivalry in Europe, and designated Windsor as its permanent home. The Garter was not merely ceremonial. It was a political instrument, binding the most powerful knights in the realm to the king through ritual, honour, and obligation. The chapel, the feasts, the processions, all of it was designed to make loyalty visible and disloyalty unthinkable. Windsor was the stage, the chivalric code was the script, and Edward was both author and lead performer. Then he set about rebuilding the castle to match his vision. The project, which consumed the last 2 decades of his reign, was enormous. Edward placed William of Wakeham, the Bishop of Winchester, in charge of the works. 3 new courts were built in the upper ward. A new gatehouse rose at the western entrance. Luxurious apartments for the king and his queen, Philippa of Hainault, were arranged around a series of internal courtyards. St George's Hall was created for the Garter ceremonies, a vast chamber designed to hold the banners and insignia of the knights. The scale was deliberate. Edward wanted architecture that felt muscular, martial, and unmistakably royal. He wanted visitors to feel small, and he succeeded. The men who built Edward's Windsor are slightly less invisible than their Saxon predecessors, but only slightly. We know that William of Wykeham oversaw the design. We know that masons, carpenters, plasterers, and glaziers were brought from across the country. We know that the earliest weight-driven mechanical clock in England was installed in the Round Tower in 1354. We know that the budget was immense, and that the castle was used to hold French prisoners captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1357, including King John II of France, who was ransomed for a fortune. What we do not know is how many ordinary men spent their lives hauling stone up the chalk bluff, or how many were injured, or what they were paid, or whether they went home at the end of the day to families who never saw the inside of the rooms they had built. The records are silent. The silence is the record. In the decades that followed, Geoffrey Chaucer served as Clerk of the King's Works at Windsor. The same man who wrote the Canterbury Tales walked these corridors and inspected these accounts. The castle attracted genius and absorbed it into its fabric. But genius came and went, the building endured, and it continued to grow. In 1475, Edward IV began construction of the new St George's Chapel in the lower ward, a masterpiece of Perpendicular Gothic architecture. That took over 50 years to complete and would become one of the supreme achievements of English medieval design. The stone vaulting soared. The stained glass blazed. The carved oak stalls of the Garter Knights, made from 1478 onward by craftsmen working at wages recorded in the castle accounts, lined the choir like sentinels. a principal smith named John Tressilian, paid the high wage of 16 pence a day, forged the intricate iron gates that still guard the chapel entrance. His name survives because the accounts recorded his cost. Most names did not survive. Most costs were human, and human costs were not itemised. The Tudor monarchs used Windsor as they used everything, strategically. Henry VIII rebuilt the principal gateway, constructed a tennis court at the base of the mound, and hosted Garter feasts of such extravagance that the size of the royal retinue had to be restricted. During the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, when rebellion swept the north, Henry retreated to Windsor and directed his military response from behind its walls. Elizabeth I found much of the castle in disrepair when she arrived, and spent the 1570s restoring and improving it, adding a long gallery overlooking the North Terrace that later became the Royal Library. The castle served the Tudors well, but the century that followed would test it in ways no monarch had imagined. During the English Civil War, Windsor became something it had never been before: a prison. Parliamentary forces seized the castle in 1642 under Colonel John Venn, and for the next decade it served as a military headquarters, a barracks, and a jail for captured royalist officers. The treasures of St George's Chapel were looted. The Garter insignia was stripped. Oliver Cromwell himself used the castle as a base, and, after being named Lord Protector, made it one of his official residences. But the darkest chapter came in the winter of 1649. Charles I, already a prisoner of Parliament, was brought to Windsor under armed guard for the last 3 weeks of his reign. He was tried for treason and sentenced to death. On the 30th of January 1649 at Whitehall in London, the king was led through a window of the banqueting house onto a scaffold built against its walls. He wore 2 shirts against the cold so that the crowd would not see him shiver and mistake it for fear. He was beheaded. The executioner held the severed head aloft to the crowd, but did not speak the customary words. He did not want his voice recognised. The following day, the king's head was sewn back onto his body. The corpse was embalmed, placed in a lead coffin, and on the night of the 7th of February, carried back to Windsor through a snowstorm. As the coffin, draped in black velvet, was brought to the west end of St George's Chapel, the snow fell thick and white upon the pole. A witness called it the colour of innocency. The king was laid in the vault beneath the chapel without ceremony, without prayers from the Book of Common Prayer, without the rites he had devoted his life to defending. He was placed beside Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. No words were spoken. The castle had swallowed another king. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought Charles II to the throne, and with him came the most extravagant transformation Windsor had seen since Edward III. Charles was determined to make Windsor a symbol of royal resurgence. He hired the architect Hugh May, and together they created the most opulently Baroque interiors ever executed in England. Ceilings were painted by Antonio Verrio. Woodwork was carved by Grinling Gibbons. The state apartments became theatres of splendour designed to rival Versailles. Charles also commissioned the Long Walk, a 3-mile avenue of elms stretching from the castle into the Great Park, planted between 1680 and 1685, is 1,652 trees, spaced 9 metres apart. The walk still exists. It is one of the longest tree-lined avenues in Europe, ambition measured in timber and earth. But after Charles II, Windsor fell from favour. William III preferred Hampton Court. Queen Anne preferred a small house beside the castle walls. The early Hanoverian kings ignored Windsor almost entirely. For nearly a century, the greatest castle in England sat half empty, its Baroque splendours gathering dust. It was not until George III, who came to the throne in 1760, that the castle was fully inhabited again. George, father of 15 children, needed space. He also needed Windsor for something else entirely. His mother, Queen Charlotte, had called Windsor the coldest house, rooms, and passages that ever existed. George spent over £150,000 on improvements, working with the architect James Wyatt to give the exterior Gothic appearance, adding battlements, turrets, and new stairways. He purchased paintings, moved collections from other royal palaces, and extended the Great Park with new farms, dairies, and the restored Virginia Water Lake. Windsor was becoming a home again. Then the walls closed in. In 1788, during a dinner at the castle, the king fell ill with what was diagnosed as madness. He was removed to the White House at Kew for treatment, and although he temporarily recovered, the episodes returned. By 1811, George was permanently incapacitated, blind and confused, confined to his apartments at Windsor, while his son ruled as Prince Regent. The castle that had imprisoned Charles I now imprisoned its own king. The walls that were built to keep enemies out had become walls that kept a broken monarch in. It was George IV who created the Windsor Castle the world recognises today. No single monarch has left a deeper physical mark on the building. George came to the throne in 1820 with a lifelong obsession with architecture and an appetite for grandeur that bordered on compulsion. His previous residence, Carlton House in London, and the Royal Pavilion in Brighton had been transformed at enormous expense, but were too small for the court functions George envisaged. Windsor, he decided, would become the definitive expression of British royal power. His mother, Queen Charlotte, had called the castle the coldest house, rooms, and passages that ever existed. George intended to change that. In 1824, Parliament voted £300,000 for the restoration. George selected the architect Geoffrey Wyatt, who upon receiving the commission changed his name to Wyattville to distinguish himself from his many architect relatives. Wyattville moved into the Winchester Tower at Windsor and would live there for the rest of his life. The scale of his ambition was extraordinary. He was the first architect to look at Windsor as a single composition rather than a collection of buildings from different centuries. His plan was to impose Gothic coherence on the entire upper ward, raise towers, add battlements, reconstruct the state apartments, and transform a medieval fortress into a romantic palace. The Round Tower had always been a squat, unglamorous structure. Wyattville solved this by adding a hollow stone crown on top, a false upper story 33 feet high that gave the castle its iconic silhouette visible from miles in every direction. It was, in essence, a theatrical prop, a fiction built in stone, and it worked. Inside, the transformation was even more radical. St George's Hall was doubled in length. The Waterloo Chamber was created by roofing over an open courtyard, producing a vast hall lit by a clear estuary, designed to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon, hung with portraits of the Allied sovereigns and commanders, and fitted with a dining table that seated 150. A grand corridor was added along two sides of the quadrangle, allowing movement through the castle without passing through individual rooms. New state apartments were furnished by the firm of Morel & Seddon in the French Empire style, supervised by George himself with obsessive personal attention. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, called it the King's new hobby horse. The Duke of Wellington found George thinking of nothing but his improvements and alterations. Among the craftsmen employed was a 15-year-old apprentice named Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who would grow up to become one of the most important architects of the 19th century. Genius passed through Windsor again, as it always had, and again the castle absorbed it. The budget of £300,000 was obliterated. The final cost exceeded £1 million, a staggering sum equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Parliament protested. George did not care. He moved into the castle in December 1828, cheerfully ignoring the inconvenience of several hundred workmen still labouring near the royal apartments. He celebrated New Year there with friends in January 1829. By March 1830, his health was failing. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV died in his new bedroom at Windsor Castle. He had lived in the building he spent a fortune transforming for barely 18 months. The work was still unfinished. Wyattville continued under George's successor, William IV, and by the time of his own death in 1840, the castle was broadly complete. But the man who had dreamed it into existence never saw it finished. The house consumed the king before the king could consume the house. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert made Windsor their principal royal residence, despite Victoria's early complaint that the castle was dull and tiresome and prison-like. Albert threw himself into improvements. He redesigned the estate, oversaw restoration of towers in the lower ward, directed the construction of the 100 steps leading down into Windsor town, and supervised the work of architects Anthony Salvin and Edward Blore across the entire complex. Victoria bore 9 children, The castle filled with life. Christmas trees were introduced to the family's celebrations at Windsor, a tradition Albert imported from Germany that spread across Britain and eventually around the world. For 2 decades, the castle hummed with purpose and activity. Then, on the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert died in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old. Victoria's world collapsed. She ordered Albert's rooms preserved exactly as they had been at the moment of his death. His clothes were laid out each evening. Fresh water was brought to his washstand every morning. The castle was draped in mourning, and Victoria retreated into a grief so absolute that it reshaped the monarchy itself. She refused to use Buckingham Palace and conducted all official business from Windsor, rarely appearing in public for decades. Rudyard Kipling would later popularise the phrase the widow of Windsor. The castle became a mausoleum for a living queen. Gradually, towards the end of her reign, entertainments returned. Plays and operas were staged in the Waterloo Chamber, but the shadow of Albert's death never fully lifted. Victoria had found Windsor tiresome. Albert had made it bearable. Without him, the castle became a monument to the only man she had ever loved. Every fireplace in the castle, all 300 of them, was maintained by the King's fendersmith, a role passed from father to son, a single man responsible for keeping warmth alive in a building that spanned 13 acres, and still the fires had to be lit, still the corridors had to be swept, still the hundreds of staff moved through their invisible routines beneath the state apartments, keeping the illusion of order alive while upstairs, the most powerful woman in the world sat alone. The 20th century brought Windsor 2 world wars and a transformation as profound as anything George IV had imagined, though far less glamorous. Under Edward VII and George V, the castle maintained its role as a centre of court life. George V kept around 660 servants at Windsor, committed to the motto that everything was to be of the best. But in 1917, with Britain at war with Germany and anti-German sentiment poisoning public life, George made a decision that would bind the castle's identity to the monarchy forever. The royal family's name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, an inheritance from Prince Albert's German lineage. George changed it. He chose the name Windsor. The castle gave the dynasty its identity. The walls named the family. Edward VIII, who succeeded in 1936, barely used the castle. He preferred Fort Belvedere in the Great Park. His reign lasted less than a year. In December 1936, Edward sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and made his abdication speech to the British Empire. He said he chose love over the crown and took the title Duke of Windsor as he walked away from the throne. The castle had witnessed coronations, imprisonments, deaths and transformations. Now it witnessed a king giving up everything the castle represented. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Windsor became a fortress once again. Loudspeakers were installed to warn of air raids, basements were converted into shelters, blackout curtains covered every window so that from the sky the castle would be invisible. The crown jewels were hidden. Precious drawings from the royal collection were sent to the National Library of Wales for safekeeping. Historic documents from the Royal Archives were moved from the Round Tower into underground storage. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, aged 13 and 9, were evacuated to Windsor for safety. They would spend most of the war within its walls. Along with the rest of the country, they were encouraged to dig for victory, growing their own fruit and vegetables in allotments within the castle grounds. The Great Kitchen at Windsor, which had been in continuous use since the reign of Edward III over 6 centuries of unbroken service, adapted to wartime rationing. In October 1940, the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth made her first public speech, a radio broadcast to the children of Britain and the Commonwealth, transmitted from the castle during the BBC Children's Hour. In April 1942, she carried out her first official public engagement, inspecting the Grenadier Guards at Windsor, having recently been appointed their colonel, and each Christmas, the 2 princesses staged pantomimes in the Waterloo Chamber, the same hall that George IV had created to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon. Cinderella in 1941, Sleeping Beauty in 1942, Aladdin in 1943. The performances raised money for the Royal Household Wool Fund, which supplied knitting yarn to make comforters for soldiers at the front. Audiences of up to 600 people watched a teenage future queen perform in gold brocade and turquoise. Prince Philip, then a young naval officer, sat in the front row during the 1943 performance of Aladdin. It was not long after that the Queen's grandmother wrote to a friend that the pair had been in love for the past 18 months. Romance bloomed in a castle built for war. The hall that had held portraits of Wellington's allies now held fairy tale pictures, painted on wallpaper by a teenage evacuee named Claude Wattham, who shared a makeshift studio in the Garter throne room with the painter Sir Gerald Kelly. When the war ended, the Lawrence portraits were returned to the Waterloo chamber walls and the fairy tale pictures were covered over. They stayed hidden for 75 years, only revealed again in 2020 during routine maintenance. The castle held its secrets close. It always had. On the 20th of November 1992, the adaptation was tested again. At approximately 11:15 in the morning, a spotlight in the Queen's private chapel, Victoria's Chapel, installed at the eastern end of St George's Hall more than a century earlier, overheated and ignited a curtain beside the altar. The Queen's Chapel would soon be consumed. Within minutes, the fire was unstoppable. It ripped through the roof spaces, destroying ceilings, gutting the private chapel, the state dining room, the crimson drawing room, and the entirety of St George's Hall. Within 3 hours, 225 firefighters from 7 counties were battling the blaze, using 36 pumps and discharging 1.5 million gallons of water. The fire burned for 15 hours. 115 rooms were damaged or destroyed. 9 staterooms were gutted. The firefighters worked through rain and smoke. Prince Andrew, who was in the castle at the time, helped form human chains to rescue furniture, paintings and porcelain. 300 clocks were saved. Thousands of books and manuscripts from the Royal Library were carried to safety. A table 150 feet long and a carpet 120 feet long were dragged from the Waterloo chamber. Soldiers from the household cavalry arrived from nearby barracks, and removal vans were summoned from across the home counties. The quadrangle filled with some of the finest examples of French 18th century furniture, paintings by Van Dyck, Rubens and Gainsborough, and Sèvres porcelain, laid out on tarpaulins in the rain. The treasures of the castle lay exposed. The castle's own fire brigade, 20 men, 6 of them full-time, based in stables 2 miles to the south, had arrived within minutes. It was not enough. Nothing could have been enough. The date was no accident of cruelty, but it felt like one. The 20th of November was the Queen's 45th wedding anniversary. It fell in a year she would later describe in a speech at the Guildhall as an annus horribilis. 3 of her children's marriages had collapsed, and now the oldest royal home in the world was burning. The question that followed the fire was not architectural but political. Who would pay? Windsor Castle was technically owned by the state, not the monarch, but it was not insured. It was too valuable to insure. Initial estimates suggested £60 million for restoration. The Heritage Secretary announced that the government would foot the bill. The public erupted. 90% of the British public, according to polls, opposed taxpayer funding. The fury was not merely fiscal, it was existential. A nation in recession was being asked to repair a palace for a family whose wealth was incalculable and untaxed. The taxpayer anger ran deep. The Queen responded with a series of unprecedented concessions. She contributed £2 million from her personal funds. She agreed to start paying income tax for the first time since the 1930s, making her the first British monarch in over half a century to do so. She opened Buckingham Palace to the public for the first time in history, charging £8 for admission, with the proceeds directed to Windsor's restoration. The castle that had always consumed now had to earn. The restoration, led by the conservation architects Donald Insall Associates, was completed in 5 years at a final cost of £36.5 million, coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. St George's Hall was rebuilt with a new hammer beam roof of sustainable English oak, constructed using traditional methods and tools in a design that evoked the 14th century through a 20th century lens. A new room, the lantern lobby, replaced the private chapel where the fire had begun. The completion date was the 20th of November 1997. 5 years to the day after the fire, the Queen's 50th wedding anniversary. The castle had burned. The castle had been rebuilt. The symmetry felt almost scripted. Queen Elizabeth II spent most weekends at Windsor throughout her reign. She was there during the pandemic, isolating within the walls that had sheltered monarchs from plague 500 years earlier. On the 8th of September 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the Queen died. But it was to Windsor that she was returned. She was interred in the King George VI Memorial Chapel within St George's Chapel, beside her husband, her father, her mother and her sister. The castle that had held the bodies of kings since the 15th century held hers now too. The family that had taken its name from the castle was buried within it. Stand at the foot of the Long Walk on a winter afternoon, with the round tower rising against a pale sky, and you see what every visitor has seen for 200 years, a silhouette of authority, permanence and sin and continuity. But look closer and the picture complicates. The round tower is 33 feet of hollow stone crown, a stage set designed by Wyatville to make a squat medieval keep look dramatic. The Gothic battlements are 19th century additions imposed on 17th century Baroque walls. The state apartments are a Georgian fantasy of medieval grandeur, rebuilt after a fire in 1992 using sustainable oak and modern engineering hidden behind period facades. Windsor Castle is not one building. It is 1,000 years of reinvention, each generation erasing and rewriting what came before, each monarch reshaping the stone to serve the story they needed to tell. William needed a fortress. Edward needed a temple to chivalry. George IV needed a palace to rival Versailles. Victoria needed a shrine to grief. Elizabeth II needed a symbol of stability in a century that offered none. The castle gave them all what they wanted. The castle always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Because beneath the gold and the oak and the Garter banners and the bones of 12 kings, there is a chalk mound 100 feet above the Thames, dug by men whose names were never recorded, in the service of a conqueror who spoke a language they did not understand. That mound is still there. It is the oldest thing at Windsor, and it asks the oldest question: who really built this? And what did it cost? If this story moved you, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me which British estate or castle you want me to investigate next. The walls are waiting.